Hello everyone, Dark Skeleton here, and today we're going to be talking about all the Hearthstone nerfs since the official release of the game. Now, you might actually notice that the length of this video isn't all that long, and that's simply because since release, Blizzard hasn't been releasing that many drastic changes to the cards of the game. Rather, they like to release new cards, as you'd listen to Ben Brode talk about on the official Hearthstone channel. So to get things started, back in the day, Unleash the Hounds used to be a very different card in the alpha set. It used to be, I believe, give all your beasts +1 attack and charge, and then at some point it was changed into Unleash the Hounds, create a 1/1 dog with charge for each opponent that your opponent has. It was originally made 4 mana, and no one played that version of the card. Then it was dropped to 2 mana, which was actually insane. You probably already know that Unleash the Hounds right now for 3 mana is really good. So the nerf came when they realized that it was absurd for you to get 3, 4, 5 charging dogs for 2 mana just simply because your opponent decided to play any minions whatsoever. So the nerf that came, of course, was nerfing the mana cost up from 2 to 3 mana, which in my opinion probably put it in a much more balanced spot. Hasn't really been too much of a problem card recently, but it's still been a staple in Hunter decks as a solid card that punishes your opponent for committing too many minions to the board. If you can believe it, there was a point in time when Starving Buzzard was actually one of the most game-breaking cards that Hunters had available to them. And that's back when it costed 2 mana. And yes, there was actually a point in time where I believe Starving Buzzard cost 2 mana and Unleash the Hounds also cost 2 mana. So 4 mana, get a full field, draw 5 cards. Yeah, pretty balanced. But even after the Unleash the Hounds nerf, Blizzard realized that Starving Buzzard was still really crazy good. Being a draw engine that only costs 2 mana itself, they felt that they had to nerf it all the way down to a 5 mana 3/2, which is actually a buff in stats, but the stats are irrelevant. At 5 mana, the card has pretty much been unplayable, and has not seen any reemergence in Hunter decks since. However, that didn't kill the Hunter class. If you look at the meta currently, the Hunter is actually very, very healthy. Mid-range Hunters are still a big thing. They just don't rely on card draw engines like Starving Buzzard, which they used to. Now here's a card that used to be used for combo decks well before Grim Patron even existed. Leroy Jenkins. Used to be a 4 mana minion, which charged your opponent's face for 6 damage. Now, that in itself isn't completely insane, but what made this so good is that you could combine it with other cards like Power Overwhelming Faceless Manipulator if you're a Warlock, or Shadow Step and Cold Blood if you're a Rogue. And by abusing the fact that it's a low mana charge minion that also has a lot of base damage, you could use it as a finisher that just eliminates people from 20 health to 0 in Warlocks and Rogue decks, but also other classes as well. So in order to answer this, Blizzard nerfed the mana cost from 4 to 5. It hasn't seen nearly as much play since, but you will still occasionally see Leroy Jenkins as an off-the-wall kind of finisher that some people like to throw into their decks. Here's a change which is a little bit more minor. Eaglehorn Bow. It used to actually activate its effect where it gains +1 durability on every single secret that was revealed, not just the Hunters. And this started to become a little bit of a problem, I think, after Mad Scientist came out, and secrets were much more playable in mage decks. So, as a mage, playing, say, Mirror Entity, you would get rather punished by the Hunter just having an Eaglehorn Bow out, and this kind of had an unfair interaction for those two classes specifically, where the Hunter would just get a free advantage. And Blizzard decided that, it might be more fair if the Eaglehorn Bow only worked on your own secrets. If the old version still existed today, I imagine that the new Secrets Paladin deck, Dr. 6, would have a heck of a time beating a Hunter that has a 6-charge Eaglehorn Bow. These next 3 changes were actually made simultaneously. So first, Flare. It used to actually be a 1 mana card, and it was a 1 mana card that also draws you a card, so it's automatically a cycle against non-secrets decks. But against a deck that actually does have secrets, it's absolutely devastating. Kind of in the line with the Eaglehorn Bow mechanic that they had to nerf. If you were playing Flare against a mage deck and you just destroy one or more of their secrets, especially if they're playing Freeze Mage, essentially for about free, because it's 1 mana draw card and destroy all your opponent's secrets, you just get way too much value out of that card. Flare was being run in pretty much every Hunter deck at the time, I mean, if I recall, simply because having to pay 1 mana to cycle isn't really that big of a deal, so there's not much of a drawback, but against the secret decks, it could actually be almost like a free win in some cases. So that was made into a 2 mana card, which hasn't been seen nearly as often, but in response to the Secrets Paladins coming out, a couple hunters have actually tried to run 1 copy of Flare simply to eliminate all the Paladin secrets at once. That said, it's still a pretty unreliable card, so it hasn't seen mainstream use again. Another change that was made was Soulfire being moved from a 0 mana card to a 1 mana card, and what made this so crazy was that for 0 mana you were dealing 4 damage. Yes, it makes you discard a card, but in decks like Zoo Warlock, you might not even have any cards left in your hand, in which case it is literally play a card for free, deal 4 damage, and that's usually enough to remove most minions off the board. Even in Handlock, the tempo swing was large enough to justify discarding one of your cards from your hand. As a 1 mana card, it's still actually playable and does see occasional use. It has been kind of overshadowed by the new Dark Bomb 2 mana, deal 3 damage without discarding a card. But I think most people would be in agreement that at 0 mana, Soulfire was just simply far too powerful. Now this change might be a little bit confusing because the Gadget Sand Actioneer actually only has 4/4 stats and it used to be 5 mana. At which point, a 4/4 5 mana isn't really that impressive. But you look at its effect, you draw a card whenever you cast a spell. It doesn't really seem like too big of an issue at 6 mana. I mean, it rarely gets played anymore. But at 5 mana, there was a deck called Miracle Rogue, which revolved around using cheap spells to cycle through your deck very quickly. And through the sheer amount of card draw you could get off of Gadget Sand Auctioneer, especially if you could use it on multiple turns through Shadow Step or Conceal, you could get so many cards in your hand that you can simply burst your opponent down with either charge minions, like what used to be Leroy Jenkins, or direct damage spells like Eviscerate and Sinister Strike. In a lot of ways, the Gadget Sand Auctioneer shared the same too much card value out of a relatively cheap card that Starving Buzzard did. You were just getting too much power, and it's what absolutely made the Miracle Rogue deck, which was very difficult to play against, like the Grim Patron deck is right now. So Blizzard put an end to that, made it 6 mana, which is far harder to play as an effective Miracle-type deck, where you're just drawing all of these spells, and then draw more spells and more spells until you finish your opponent off. Now, speaking of the Grim Patron deck, Grim Patron has been very powerful in the meta for the past few months, ever since Blackrock Mountain came out, and Blizzard has decided that the deck is a problem, or more specifically, the card Warsong Commander is a problem, because this card allows you to make any minion with 3 or less attack, at least when it comes onto the field, able to charge immediately, which with Grim Patron means you could charge it into an opponent's minion and get more Grim Patrons, which immediately get charged again, and so on and so forth until you just overwhelm the board and win. Now, this change hasn't been made yet, but it is coming out in a few days. Warsong Commander is no longer going to grant minions charge, but rather minions with charge that are on your side of the field are going to have +1 attack, which, if you think about it for half a second, is a very underwhelming effect. Removing the charge potential for Grim Patron decks likely will mean that the Grim Patron won't be seen for a while until some other mechanic comes along to actually make that deck playable again. And since Warsong Commander really doesn't have much more benefit than a raid leader anymore, it's probably going to be a card that's never seen again in constructed play. But that's actually all the changes that have occurred to Hearthstone since the official release of the game. Yes, in the alpha and beta stages there were other card changes. If you want to go back and read them, you can find them on the different wikis out there. But for this video, I've been Dark Skeleton. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.